What if the person you trusted most was hiding a secret so devastating that it could destroy everything they had built? What if the teacher your child adored, the woman who won Teacher of the Year 3 times, the educator who inspired a generation of students to fall in love with reading, could not read herself? This is not a hypothetical. This is the story of Patricia Johnson and what God did with her shame, her secret, and her brokenness will leave you in tears. Because the miracle in this story is not what you think it is. It is not about a woman who learned to read. It is about a God who takes the very thing we are most ashamed of and turns it into the very thing that saves us. But before I tell you about the miracle, you need to understand the mask, because Patricia Johnson wore the most convincing mask you have ever seen. And she wore it every single day for 20 years. Room 214 at Benjamin Banneker Elementary School on the south side of Chicago was, by any measure, a magical place. Walk through the door and you would think you had stepped into a storybook. The walls were covered in hand-painted murals of castles and dragons and faraway kingdoms. Paper butterflies hung from the ceiling on invisible threads, turning slowly in the draft from the heating vent. The reading corner was a nest of beanbag chairs and pillows, and a hand-stitched canopy that Patricia had made herself, because she believed, with a conviction that bordered on religion, that children needed to feel safe before they could learn. And they did learn. The students in Miss Johnson's 3rd grade class consistently outperformed every other class in the school on standardized tests. Her reading scores were legendary. Parents fought to get their children into her classroom. The waiting list was longer than any other teachers in the district. Miss Patricia Johnson was 43 years old. She was a tall, striking African-American woman with high cheekbones and deep brown eyes that could communicate warmth and authority in equal measure. She wore her hair in neat braids pinned up with a silver clip, and she dressed every day in bright, carefully chosen colors, because she told her students that color was the language of hope, and their classroom would always speak hope. She had a voice that could quiet a cafeteria of 300 children with a single sentence, and a laugh that could fill the same cafeteria with joy. She was, by every external measure, the embodiment of what a teacher should be. Dedicated, passionate, effective, beloved. The awards were proof. 3 times Teacher of the Year at Banneker Elementary. Twice nominated for the district's Excellence in Education Award. A commendation from the mayor's office for her after-school literacy program. A profile in the Chicago Tribune under the headline, "The Reading Whisperer: How One Teacher is Changing Lives on the South Side." The article described her methods, her passion, her ability to reach children that other teachers had given up on. It quoted parents who said she had saved their children's academic careers. It quoted the principal, Dr. Linda Williams, who called Patricia the heartbeat of this school. The article did not mention that Patricia Johnson could not read. It did not mention this because no one knew. Not Dr. Williams, not her colleagues, not the parents who adored her, not the students who looked up at her every morning with trusting eyes and open hearts, not her pastor, Reverend James Crawford, who had tried for years to get her to read scripture during Sunday service. Not even her closest friend, another teacher named Denise, who had worked across the hall from Patricia for 12 years and thought she knew everything about her. No one knew, because Patricia had built the most elaborate, the most exhausting, the most heartbreakingly effective system of deception that you can imagine. And she had maintained it without a single crack for 20 years. Patricia had severe dyslexia. Not the mild kind that makes reading slightly more difficult, the kind that can be managed with extra time on tests and larger fonts. Patricia's dyslexia was profound and debilitating, a neurological condition that turned every printed word into a puzzle made of moving pieces. When she looked at a page of text, the letters did not stay still. They rotated, inverted, swapped positions, and danced across the page in patterns that bore no resemblance to the words they were supposed to form. A simple sentence like, "The cat sat on the mat," might appear to her as, "Et, tac, tas, no, et, tam," or worse, a jumble of shapes that her brain refused to decode into language. Reading a single paragraph took her the time and effort that most people would spend on an entire chapter. Reading an entire book was a marathon of frustration and failure that left her physically exhausted and emotionally devastated. She had been this way since childhood. Born in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago to a single mother who worked 2 jobs and did not have the time or the resources to investigate why her daughter struggled in school. Patricia was labeled slow by her first-grade teacher, lazy by her third-grade teacher, not college material by her high school guidance counselor. She sat in classrooms where reading was the gateway to everything, and she could not pass through the gate. She watched other children read aloud with ease and fluency, and she felt the way a person with a broken leg feels watching others run. Not angry exactly, but hollowed out by a longing so deep it had no bottom. But Patricia was not slow. She was not lazy. She was brilliant. Her IQ, when it was finally tested in college by a professor who noticed that her verbal answers were extraordinary, while her written work was nearly illegible, was 142. She had a memory that was close to photographic for things she heard. She could listen to a lecture once and recite it almost word for word 3 weeks later. She could absorb information through conversation, through audio, through observation, with a speed and depth that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Her brain was a marvel. It simply could not decode printed text. And so Patricia had adapted, not in the way that schools encourage, with accommodations and support plans and specialized instruction. She had adapted the way a person adapts when they are drowning and no one is throwing a rope. She had adapted by hiding, by compensating, by building an empire of workarounds so sophisticated that no one in 20 years of professional life had ever detected the foundation of sand beneath it. Every night after the students went home and the building grew quiet, Patricia would sit at her kitchen table and prepare for the next day. She would play audiobook versions of every text her students would encounter. She would listen to them over and over, dozens of times, until she had memorized not just the words, but the inflections, the pauses, the rhythm of the sentences. She would record herself reading aloud from memory and then play it back, comparing it to the audiobook, adjusting her performance until it was seamless. When she stood in front of her class the next morning and read from the textbook, she was not reading. She was performing, reciting from memory with the book open in her hands as a prop, the way an actor holds a script they have already memorized, turning the pages at the right moments, her eyes moving across the text as if she were following the words. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. And it was her entire life. Every single day, Patricia Johnson woke up with a stone of dread in her stomach and the same prayer on her lips. God, please don't let them find out today. Please, not today. This was her prayer, not a prayer for healing, not a prayer for courage, not a prayer for freedom, a prayer for concealment, a prayer to keep the mask in place for one more day. Because Patricia believed, with a certainty that was as deep and as dark as her dyslexia itself, that if anyone discovered the truth, everything would be over. Her career, her reputation, her relationships, the respect of her students, the trust of their parents. All of it would crumble the moment the words came out, "Miss Johnson cannot read." And she could not survive that. She could survive the dyslexia. She had been surviving it for 43 years. But she could not survive the shame. The shame was the real disability. The shame was the prison. And the door of that prison was about to be blown wide open, not by an enemy, but by a God who loved her too much to let her stay locked inside. To understand the magnitude of what Patricia Johnson accomplished every single day, You need to understand the architecture of her deception, because it was not a simple lie. It was a cathedral of lies, each one supporting the others, each one requiring constant maintenance, each one carrying a weight that would have crushed a lesser person. Patricia did not just hide her dyslexia. She built an entire parallel reality in which she was a fluent reader. And she inhabited that reality so completely, so convincingly, that it became for everyone around her the truth. The preparation began every Sunday evening. Patricia would receive the lesson plans for the coming week, plans she had written herself using voice-to-text software on her computer, and she would begin the process of memorization. The third grade curriculum required daily reading from textbooks in language arts, social studies, science, and mathematics. Each subject had its own textbook, its own vocabulary, its own specific passages that the teacher was expected to read aloud, explain, and discuss. For a typical teacher, preparing to read these passages might take 30 minutes. For Patricia, it took 6 to 8 hours. She would use a text-to-speech program to have the computer read each passage to her. Then she would listen to it again with earbuds while following along in the physical book, trying to match the spoken words to the printed ones, forcing her brain to make connections that it resisted with every neuron. Then she would record herself reciting the passage from memory and play it back, checking for accuracy, for fluency, for the natural cadence that would make it sound spontaneous rather than rehearsed. By Tuesday, she had the week's readings memorized. By Wednesday, she could recite them while simultaneously turning pages, pointing to diagrams, and making eye contact with her students. A performance so seamless that the most observant colleague would have seen nothing but a teacher who loved her material. Thursday and Friday were for review and adjustment because sometimes a student would ask a question that required her to refer to a specific line in the text, and she needed to know exactly where every word was on every page. Not because she could read it, but because she had memorized its position the way a blind person memorizes the layout of their home. The written portions of her job were an entirely separate challenge. Teachers write constantly lesson plans, report cards, parent letters, hall passes, discipline referrals, meeting notes, emails. Patricia handled each of these with a different strategy. Lesson plans were written at home using voice-to-text software that converted her spoken words into typed documents. Report cards were completed using a template she had created years ago, with pre-written comments that she could select and customize using simple keyboard shortcuts. Parent letters were drafted by her classroom aide, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, whom Patricia had convinced that delegation was a management skill rather than a necessity. Emails were dictated into her phone and sent through a speech-to-text app. And for anything that required on-the-spot writing, a signature, a note to a colleague, a quick message on the whiteboard, Patricia had developed a handwriting so deliberately illegible that no one could tell whether the words were correct or not. She joked about it. "My handwriting is a medical mystery," she would tell colleagues with a laugh. "Even I can't read it." And everyone would laugh with her, not knowing that the joke was the truest thing she had ever said. Church was its own battlefield. Patricia had attended Mount Zion Baptist Church since she was a girl, carried there by her mother every Sunday, dressed in her best, her hair freshly braided, her shoes polished to a mirror shine. She loved the church. She loved the music, the community, the sense of belonging, the feeling of God's presence that settled over the congregation during worship, like a warm blanket on a cold night. She loved Reverend Crawford's sermons, which she absorbed through her extraordinary auditory memory, with a depth and nuance that most people achieved only through repeated reading of the text. She could quote scripture better than most deacons because she had listened to the entire Bible on audio multiple times, and her memory had filed each verse in a mental library that she could access instantly. But Reverend Crawford, a warm, enthusiastic man who believed that every member of the congregation should participate actively in worship, was always asking people to read scripture from the pulpit. He saw it as an act of service, a way of honoring God with your voice. And he had been asking Patricia for years, "Sister Patricia, you have such a beautiful speaking voice. Won't you read the lesson for us this Sunday?" And every time, Patricia would produce an excuse. A sore throat, a cold, laryngitis that conveniently appeared every time she was asked to approach the pulpit with an open Bible. She developed a reputation for having a fragile throat, and the congregation accepted it with sympathy and without suspicion. Because why would anyone suspect that the teacher of the year, the woman who read to children for a living, could not read? The toll of this double life was immense. Patricia lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror. Every day was a tightrope walk over an abyss, and the wind was always blowing. Every unexpected request to read something, every new form to fill out, every surprise meeting where documents were distributed was a potential exposure event. She had developed an anxiety disorder that she managed with breathing exercises and the occasional glass of wine. And the nightly prayer that had become less a conversation with God and more a desperate negotiation. Keep my secret safe. One more day, just one more day. She was lonely. The secret isolated her as effectively as any prison wall. She could not be fully known because being fully known meant being fully exposed. She kept people at arm's length, not because she did not want connection, but because connection required vulnerability, and vulnerability required truth. And the truth was the one thing she could not afford to share. Their friendships were warm but shallow. Their romantic relationships, rare and brief, ended when the intimacy grew deep enough that the other person began to notice. The gaps, the excuses, the subtle redirections. At 43, Patricia lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment with a cat named Grace, and a secret that was slowly, methodically, relentlessly consuming her from the inside out. And every night in that apartment, after the performance was over, and the mask was off, and there was no one left to deceive, Patricia would sit at her kitchen table and open a children's book, a simple book, a book meant for 6-year-olds, and she would try to read it. She would stare at the letters and will them to hold still, will them to arrange themselves into words that made sense, will her brain to do the thing that every other brain she knew could do without effort. And the letters would dance and swap and mock her, and she would close the book and put her head in her hands and cry. Alone, in the dark, with no one to hear but Grace the cat and a God she was not sure was listening anymore. This was the life of Patricia Johnson, a life of extraordinary accomplishment built on a foundation of extraordinary pain, a life that looked like success from the outside and felt like survival from the inside, a life that could not continue the way it was going, because masks, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually crack. And the crack was coming. It was walking through the front door of Banneker Elementary School on a Monday morning in September, wearing an oversized backpack and a face full of fear. His name was Marcus. He was 8 years old, and he was about to become the mirror that would finally force Patricia Johnson to look at herself. Marcus Davis arrived at Banneker Elementary on the first Monday after Labor Day with a transfer form crumpled in his fist and an expression on his face that Patricia recognized instantly, because she had worn it herself for the first 12 years of her education. It was the expression of a child who expects to be humiliated, a child who has learned through bitter experience that school is not a place of learning, but a place of exposure, where the thing you cannot do is the thing you are required to do every hour of every day. And the other children can smell your failure the way wolves smell blood. He was small for his age, a thin, wiry boy with close-cropped hair and large, dark eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of carefully maintained wardrobe that speaks of a parent who cares deeply but has limited resources. He stood in the doorway of room 214 while Patricia read his transfer paperwork, which she pretended to read while actually scanning for the key information she had already received verbally from the office secretary. Name, age, previous school, reason for transfer, special accommodations. The reason for transfer was listed as persistent bullying and social difficulties related to learning disability. The special accommodation was listed as severe dyslexia, requires all standard LD protocols. Patricia read those words, or rather, heard them in her mind, as the secretary had spoken them, and felt something move inside her chest that was not her heart beating, but her heart breaking, because she knew. She knew what those clinical words meant in the daily experience of an 8-year-old boy. She knew what persistent bullying looked like from the inside. She knew what it felt like to have a brain that worked differently and to live in a world that had no patience for difference. She knew what Marcus Davis was carrying in that oversized backpack, and it was not textbooks. It was shame. "Class," Patricia said, her voice bright and steady, the voice she had perfected over 15 years of performance. "We have a new friend joining us today. This is Marcus Davis. Marcus, we're so happy to have you. Would you like to tell us something about yourself?" Marcus looked at her. Then he looked at the floor. Then he shook his head, the smallest, most defeated shake Patricia had ever seen. "That's perfectly fine," she said. "You'll talk when you're ready. For now, let's find you a seat. How about right here, in the front row, close to me?" She had learned years ago that children who struggled with reading needed to be close to the teacher, not in the back where they could hide and withdraw, but in the front where they could be seen and supported. It was the advice she gave other teachers. It was the advice she had never received herself. Marcus sat down. He placed his backpack on the floor and his hands in his lap and his eyes on the desk, and he did not move or speak for the rest of the morning. Patricia watched him the way a doctor watches a patient, noting the details that told the real story. The way he flinched when she announced it was time for independent reading. The way his fingers tightened around his pencil when she asked the class to write 3 sentences about their summer. The way his eyes darted to the door, calculating the distance to escape. She had seen these behaviors before, in other students, in other years. But she had never seen them with this clarity because she had never seen them in a child who mirrored her own experience so precisely. At lunch, Patricia sat in her empty classroom and ate a sandwich she could not taste. Her mind was on Marcus, the way he had tried to write those 3 sentences and produced only one, a single line of shaky, reversed letters that most of the class would not have been able to decipher, but that Patricia could read perfectly, because they were the same reversed letters she would have written at his age. She could read his dyslexic writing the way a person who speaks a dialect can understand another speaker of the same dialect. It was a language they shared, a secret code written by brains that were wired differently. And the recognition of it made Patricia feel simultaneously connected to this child and terrified of what that connection meant. Over the following weeks, Patricia watched Marcus navigate room 214 with the same survival strategies she had used as a child. When the class read aloud in a round-robin format, going desk to desk, Marcus would count ahead to determine which passage would be his and try to memorize it before his turn arrived. When he could not memorize it in time, he would ask to go to the bathroom. When bathroom breaks became too frequent, he would pretend to have a stomachache. When the stomachache excuse wore thin, he would simply sit in his chair and shake his head and say, "I can't," in a voice so small that it barely existed. The other children were kind for the most part. Patricia's classroom culture did not tolerate cruelty, and her students knew it. But children are observant, and they noticed that Marcus struggled, and even without malice, their awareness created a separation. Marcus was different. Marcus could not do what they could do. And Marcus knew that they knew. and the knowing was a wall that grew higher every day. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the semester, Patricia kept Marcus after class. She did this occasionally with students who needed extra help, and the other children thought nothing of it. Marcus sat at his desk, shoulders hunched, bracing for what he assumed would be another lecture about trying harder, applying himself, not giving up. He had heard these speeches before at his old school from teachers who meant well but did not understand that the problem was not effort. The problem was architecture. The problem was that his brain had been built with a different blueprint, and no amount of trying harder would change the blueprint. Patricia pulled a chair next to his desk and sat down. She did not speak for a moment. She just sat there, close to him, at his level, the way you sit with someone you want to communicate safety to. And then she said, very quietly, "Marcus, reading is hard for you, isn't it?" He looked up at her. His eyes, which had been so carefully blank for 3 weeks, flickered with something raw and unguarded. "Yes, ma'am." "The letters move around? They switch places?" His eyes widened. "How do you know that?" The question hung in the air. "How do you know that?" 4 words that opened a door that Patricia had kept locked for 20 years. She stood at the threshold of that door and felt a familiar terror rise up in her chest like a wave. To answer honestly would mean stepping through. It would mean telling this child the truth. It would mean beginning the process of dismantling the mask. It would mean risking everything. She did not step through. Not yet. Instead, she smiled and said, "Because I've worked with a lot of students like you, Marcus, and I want you to know that you are not stupid. You are not lazy. Your brain works differently, that's all. And different is not broken." Marcus looked at her with an expression that almost undid her. It was gratitude and hope and suspicion all at once. The expression of a child who wants desperately to believe what he is being told, but has been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "My old teacher said I was slow," he said. "Your old teacher was wrong," Patricia said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Because she was not just defending Marcus. She was defending the little girl she had been. The girl who had been called slow and lazy and not college material. The girl who had been abandoned by a system that measured intelligence by one narrow metric and found her wanting. She was defending that girl through this boy, and the ferocity of the defense surprised her. Marcus left the room that afternoon with something he had not had in a long time. A reason to come back tomorrow. And Patricia sat at her desk in the empty classroom and stared at the wall of children's books that she could not read, and felt the crack in her mask widen by another fraction of an inch, because Marcus was asking her by his very existence to be honest. And she did not know how much longer she could look at that boy's pain and pretend she did not recognize it as her own. The school district supervisor arrived on a Thursday morning in October without announcement. This was not unusual. Supervisors conducted random classroom observations several times a year as part of the district's quality assurance program. Teachers expected it, prepared for it, and generally survived it without incident. For most teachers, a supervisory visit was a minor inconvenience. For Patricia Johnson, it was the scenario she had built her entire survival system to prevent. The supervisor was a woman named Dr. Catherine Moore, a former high school principal with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard, and the brisk, evaluative manner of someone whose job is to measure and judge. She arrived during Patricia's language arts block, the period when Patricia was teaching reading, specifically the period when Patricia was performing reading. Dr. Moore seated herself in the back of the classroom, clipboard in hand, pen at the ready, and nodded for Patricia to continue. Patricia felt the first wave of panic rise from her stomach to her chest. She breathed through it. She had done this before, dozens of times. She knew the material for today's lesson by heart. She had memorized the reading passage the night before, the same passage. she had listened to 14 times on the text-to-speech program while following along in the physical book. She could do this. She had always done this. "Good morning, everyone," Patricia said, her voice steady, her smile in place. "Let's open our reading books to page 47. Today we're going to read about the water cycle." The class rustled their books. Pages turned. 25 8-year-olds found page 47. With the casual ease of children for whom finding a page in a book is not a feat of navigation, but an automatic reflex, Patricia opened her own book to page 47. The page she had memorized, the passage she could recite in her sleep. She began, "Water is everywhere on earth. It is in the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, and even in the air we breathe. But have you ever wondered how water moves from one place to another?" She was performing beautifully. Her voice was warm and expressive. Her eyes moved across the page at the right pace. She turned her body toward the class at key moments to make eye contact, then returned her gaze to the book as if re-engaging with the text. Dr. Moore was writing on her clipboard. The students were following along, and then Dr. Moore raised her hand. Patricia stopped mid-sentence. Supervisors did not usually interrupt. Something cold moved through her body, starting at the base of her spine and climbing upward. "Miss Johnson, I'm sorry to interrupt. I notice you're using the Pearson textbook for this unit. The district actually adopted a new curriculum last month, the Richardson series. Did you receive the new materials?" Patricia blinked. "I received some boxes, but I haven't had time to." "No worries," Dr. Moore said, already standing and walking to the supply closet where Patricia had indeed stacked several unopened boxes of new textbooks. She pulled one out and handed it to Patricia. "Let's use this today. I'd love to see how you integrate new material on the fly. It's one of the skills we're assessing this quarter. Can you turn to chapter 3 and read the introduction for the class?" The book was in Patricia's hands. A brand new book. A book she had never seen, never heard, never memorized. A book full of words that were, to her, as indecipherable as ancient hieroglyphics. The cover said, "Our Living Earth," in large green letters, and even those 3 words swam and twisted in her vision. She opened to chapter 3. The page was dense with text, small print, no pictures on this particular page, just row after row of black marks on white paper that her brain could not, would not, refused to assemble into meaning. "Of course," Patricia said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. She looked at the page. The letters began their dance. The D's became B's. The P's became Q's. The words ran together like watercolors in the rain. She could feel Dr. Moore's eyes on her. She could feel 25 pairs of small eyes on her. She could feel the mask beginning to slip. She cleared her throat. "Chapter 3, she said. Hour. The first word of the introduction. She could see the shapes, but could not assemble them. The letters would not hold still. They were moving, rotating, mocking her, the way they had mocked her every day of her life. But now they were doing it in front of a room full of people, in front of children who trusted her, in front of a supervisor with a clipboard. Hour. She tried again. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. Her hands were shaking. The book trembled visibly. The room had gone very quiet. The dangerous quiet of a space in which something is going wrong, and everyone can feel it, but no one knows what to do. Patricia stared at the page. The words blurred. Her vision swam. 20 years of hiding. 20 years of midnight memorization sessions. 20 years of sore throat excuses and illegible handwriting and voice-to-text software, and the relentless, exhausting, soul-crushing performance of normalcy. All of it balanced on this moment, on this page, on these letters that would not stop moving. She began to stammer. Disconnected syllables tumbled from her lips, sounds without meaning, fragments of words that dissolved before they could become sentences. The children shifted in their seats. Dr. Moore lowered her clipboard. And in the front row, Marcus Davis, the 8-year-old boy with the oversized backpack, and the dancing letters and the eyes that saw everything, looked up at his teacher with an expression of slowly dawning recognition. "Miss Johnson," he said. His voice was small but clear, cutting through the silence the way a bell cuts through fog. "Miss Johnson, are the letters moving for you too?" The room went absolutely still. Marcus was looking at her with those large, dark eyes. And in those eyes was not accusation or mockery or shock. There was something else, something Patricia had never expected to see in the eyes of a student looking at a teacher who was falling apart. Recognition, understanding, kinship. This 8-year-old boy, this child who had been called slow and stupid and who had been bullied out of his last school, was looking at his teacher and seeing himself. And his question, innocent and devastating and precise, landed on the last remaining support beam of Patricia's 20-year facade and snapped it clean in two. Patricia set the book down on her desk. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the class. She looked at Dr. Moore. And then she did the thing she had spent 20 years training herself never to do. She let the mask fall. Not deliberately, not gracefully. It simply fell, the way a structure falls when the foundation gives way, all at once, completely, with a sound that was not a crash, but a sob. The tears came first, then the shaking, then the inability to speak, to explain, to do anything but stand in front of a room full of people and be exactly what she was, a woman who could not read, exposed, unmasked, naked in the way that nightmares are naked, the kind where you are standing on a stage and realize you have forgotten your clothes and there is nowhere to hide. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She turned, and she walked out of the classroom, down the hallway, past the office, past the front door, into the October air, and she kept walking until she reached the parking lot, where she collapsed against the side of her car and slid to the ground and wept with a violence that came from a place so deep inside her that it had no name. 20 years, 7,300 days, countless lies, each one a brick in a wall that had just collapsed. And Patricia Johnson sat on the asphalt of a school parking lot with her back against her car, and her face in her hands, and her whole world in pieces around her. And she felt the thing she had feared most for 2 decades, the terrible, devastating, unbearable freedom of being known. Patricia did not go home. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, and then she stood up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and walked back into the building. She did not go back to room 214. She went to the principal's office. She went there the way a person goes to a hospital when they have been in an accident, not because they want to, but because the alternative is bleeding to death alone. Dr. Linda Williams was a woman who had seen a great deal in 30 years of education. She had navigated budget crises and staff shortages and parent uprisings and a global pandemic, and the daily grinding, beautiful chaos of running a school in one of Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. She was not easily shaken. But when Patricia Johnson walked into her office that October afternoon, with mascara tracks on her cheeks, and her hands still trembling, and a look in her eyes that was equal parts terror and exhaustion, Linda Williams stood up from her desk and knew, with the instinct that comes from 3 decades of caring for people, that something foundational had just shifted. "Patricia, sit down." "What happened?" Patricia sat. She clasped her hands in her lap. She looked at the floor, at the wall, at the window, anywhere but at the woman across the desk. And then she began to talk. Not in the polished, careful, edited way she usually spoke. In a torrent, a flood, 20 years of secret bursting through the dam in a rush of words and tears and confessions that she could not have stopped even if she wanted to. "I can't read," she said. And the words, spoken aloud for the first time in her professional life, sounded both devastating and strangely simple. 3 words: subject, verb, object. The most basic sentence structure in the English language, carrying the most complex truth of her existence. I have severe dyslexia. I've had it my whole life. I've never been able to read normally. The letters move. They switch. They don't stay where they're supposed to be. I have to memorize everything. Every lesson, every textbook, every story I read to the kids. I memorize it from audio and then I pretend to read it. I've been pretending for 20 years. For 15 years at this school. I've been lying to you. I've been lying to everyone. Every day. Every single day. She told Linda everything. The midnight memorization sessions. The text-to-speech software. The sore throat excuses at church. The illegible handwriting. The delegated letters. The constant, paralyzing fear of discovery. She told her about her childhood. About being called slow. About the guidance counselor who said she was not college material. She told her about getting through college by sheer auditory brilliance, by attending every lecture twice and recording them and playing them back until she could write papers by dictating her extraordinary understanding of material she had absorbed through her ears, while the other students absorbed it through their eyes. She told her about the graduate program in education, where she had managed to get through by the same methods, a feat of compensation so extreme that it bordered on heroic, though Patricia had never thought of it that way. She had thought of it as cheating, as fraud, as the actions of a woman who was not good enough and had to fake being good enough every day of her life. "And I'm here to resign," Patricia said. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I wrote this." A pause. A bitter, broken half-laugh. I dictated this. My resignation letter. I understand that what I've done is, I've been deceiving the school, the district, the parents. I understand if there need to be consequences." She placed the envelope on the desk. Linda Williams looked at it. She did not pick it up. She did not open it. She looked at it the way you look at something you have no intention of accepting, with a calm, firm, immovable rejection that did not need words to communicate itself. Then Linda Williams did something that Patricia did not expect. She stood up, came around the desk, pulled a chair next to Patricia's, sat down, and took both of Patricia's hands in hers. Not as a principal holding the hands of a subordinate. As a woman holding the hands of another woman who was falling apart. "Patricia," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Do you know what I just heard? I heard a woman with a severe neurological condition describe how she achieved a master's degree, built a 15-year teaching career, won 3 Teacher of the Year awards, and raised the reading scores of hundreds of children, all while battling something that would have defeated most people before they finished high school. I heard a woman describe the most remarkable display of determination, intelligence, and love for children that I have ever encountered in 30 years of education. And you're sitting here telling me you're a fraud?" Patricia looked at her through blurred eyes. "I lied, Linda, every day, for 15 years. You survived," Linda corrected. "You survived a disability that your schools failed to properly diagnose and support. You survived by using the extraordinary gifts God gave you, your memory, your intelligence, your dedication, to overcome an obstacle that most people cannot even comprehend. And in the process, you became the best teacher in this building. Not in spite of your dyslexia, Patricia. Because of it. Because you understand what it means to struggle. Because you understand what it means to feel stupid when you're not stupid. Because you love these kids the way only someone who has been where they are can love them." Linda reached for the resignation letter, picked it up and tore it in half, then in quarters, then dropped the pieces in the wastebasket. "You are not resigning," she said. "You are not being fired. You are being supported, starting now." We are going to get you every accommodation, every resource, every piece of technology that exists for adults with dyslexia. And we are going to do it openly, not in secret, not in shame, in the light, where healing happens. Patricia stared at the torn pieces of her resignation in the wastebasket and felt something so unfamiliar that she almost did not recognize it. It took her several seconds to identify the sensation. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted, not the dyslexia. The dyslexia was still there, as present and as real as it had been that morning. What was being lifted was the secret. The 20-year, 7,000-day, millions of lies secret. It was leaving her body the way a fever leaves, gradually, then all at once. And what it left behind was not emptiness, but space. Space to breathe, space to be, space to exist in the world as the person she actually was rather than the person she had been pretending to be. 2 days later, at Linda's suggestion, Patricia stood before the entire faculty of Banneker Elementary School in the staff meeting room and told them the truth. 27 teachers, 7 aides, the school counselor, the librarian, the janitor who had been at Banneker longer than anyone and who knew more about the school's secrets than the principal. They all sat and listened as Patricia Johnson, their colleague, their friend, the woman they thought they knew, revealed the truth about who she really was. When she finished, the room was silent for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. And then Mrs. Rodriguez, the classroom aide who had been helping Patricia with parent letters for years without knowing why, stood up. And Mrs. Carter, the kindergarten teacher, stood up. And Mr. Okafor, the 5th grade science teacher, stood up. One by one, every person in that room rose to their feet. Not in shock, not in judgment, in honor. They gave Patricia Johnson a standing ovation. Not for being a great teacher, though she was. Not for winning awards, though she had. For being brave, for being honest, for doing the hardest thing a person can do. Standing in front of the people you love and letting them see you as you really are. That evening, Patricia went home and fed Grace the cat and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, where she had spent 20 years failing to read children's books. And she did something she had never done before. She prayed an honest prayer, not the old prayer, not the one that begged for concealment and secrecy and one more day of hiding. The old prayer was dead. It had died in room 214 when Marcus Davis looked at her with those knowing eyes and asked if the letters moved for her too. It had died in the parking lot. It had died in the principal's office. It had died in the staff meeting. The old prayer had served its purpose, which was to keep her alive long enough to reach this moment, and now it was gone. And in its place was an emptiness that was not desolation, but possibility. The emptiness of a cleared field. The emptiness of a canvas before the first brushstroke. Patricia folded her hands on the table. Her Bible was in front of her. The same Bible her mother had given her when she was 12. The same Bible she had carried to church every Sunday for 30 years. The same Bible she had never been able to read. She placed her hands on its worn leather cover and closed her eyes and began to speak to God, the way she had once spoken to Linda Williams, without performance, without editing, without the mask. God, I'm here. I'm really here. Not the Patricia who pretends and performs and lies. The real one. The one who can't read. The one who's been hiding from you and from everyone for 20 years. I'm tired, God. I'm so tired of pretending. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of praying for my secret to stay hidden, when what I should have been praying for all along was the courage to let it out. She opened her eyes and looked at the Bible under her hands. The gold letters on the cover that spelled Holy Bible shimmered in the kitchen light, and for a moment they held still, and she could see them clearly. And then they began their familiar dance, and she could not read them anymore. But this time, the dancing letters did not fill her with shame. They filled her with something else. A question. The most important question she had ever asked. God, I've been asking you to hide my weakness. For 20 years, that's been my prayer. And you answered it. You hid it. You let me survive. But I don't think hiding was ever your plan for me, was it? I think you were waiting. Waiting for me to be brave enough to ask for something bigger. So here I am. I'm asking. I don't know what to ask for. I don't know if I should ask you to heal my dyslexia or ask you to show me how to live with it. I don't know if the miracle I need is new eyes or a new heart, but I'm done hiding. I'm done asking you to keep me in the dark. Whatever you want to do with this, with me, with this broken brain of mine, do it. I'm open. For the first time in my life, I'm completely open. She sat in the silence after the prayer and felt the peace come. Not dramatically, not with thunder or lightning or a voice from heaven. It came the way dawn comes, gradually, gently, so slowly that you cannot pinpoint the exact moment the darkness became light. It filled the kitchen. It filled her chest. It settled into the spaces that fear had occupied for 2 decades. And fear, finding itself displaced, retreated without protest, as if it had been waiting for permission to leave. The following Sunday, Patricia went to church. She sat in her usual pew, 4th row, right side, the seat she had occupied for as long as anyone could remember. But this Sunday was different. After the service, she went to Reverend Crawford and told him the truth. She told him everything, the same way she had told Linda Williams, the same torrent, the same tears, the same devastation and relief. Reverend Crawford listened. He was a man who had been pastoring for 40 years, and he had learned long ago that the most important thing a pastor can do is not speak, but listen. When Patricia finished, he nodded slowly and said, "Sister Patricia, do you know what I hear in your story? I hear a woman who has been carrying a cross alone for 20 years because she was too ashamed to ask her brothers and sisters to help carry it. That's not how the body of Christ works. We carry each other. That's our job." He asked if she would be willing to let the prayer team pray over her. Not a public spectacle, not a healing crusade with lights and cameras. A quiet, intimate gathering of believers who loved her and wanted to support her. Patricia agreed. The following Wednesday evening, in the small prayer room behind the sanctuary, 6 members of Mount Zion's prayer team gathered around Patricia Johnson. They placed their hands on her shoulders, her head, her back, and they prayed. They prayed with the authority of people who believe that God hears every word. They prayed for healing, for courage, for freedom. They prayed for Patricia's mind, that it would be renewed. They prayed for her heart, that it would be released from shame. They prayed for her future, that it would be brighter than her past. And Reverend Crawford, standing behind her with his hand on her head, prayed a prayer that Patricia would remember for the rest of her life. Lord, you knit this woman together in her mother's womb. You designed every neuron in her brain. You knew about her dyslexia before she was born. It was never a mistake. It was never a punishment. Show her what it really is. Show her your purpose in it. And give her the courage to walk in that purpose openly, without shame, for your glory. Patricia did not feel a lightning bolt. She did not hear an audible voice. She did not open her eyes and discover that the words on the page had suddenly stopped dancing. What she felt was subtler and, in many ways, more powerful than any of those things. She felt held. For the first time in 20 years, she felt held by something larger than herself, larger than her secret, larger than her shame. She felt the hands on her shoulders not just as the hands of 6 church members, but as the hands of a God who had been reaching for her every night at that kitchen table and had been waiting patiently, lovingly, for her to stop pushing him away and let him in. She drove home that night with the windows down and the cool air on her face, and a feeling in her chest that she would later describe as the first breath after a lifetime of holding her breath. She had not been healed. The dyslexia was still there. The letters would still dance tomorrow. But something else had been healed. Something deeper. Something more fundamental than the neurological condition that had shaped her life. The shame was lifting. Not gone. Not yet, but lifting. The way fog lifts in the morning. Slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once, revealing a landscape that was there all along but could not be seen. The changes began the following week. They were small at first, so small that Patricia almost missed them. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Monday evening, a children's book open in front of her. The same book she had tried and failed to read dozens of times. Green Eggs and Ham, the simplest of simple books. 26 words in the entire text. She looked at the first page, braced for the familiar dance of letters. And something was different. The letters were still moving. They still swapped and rotated and resisted her attempts to pin them down. But the movement was slower, slightly, almost imperceptibly slower, as if someone had turned down the speed on a record player by one notch. The dance was still there, but the tempo had changed. And in the spaces between the movements, in the brief moments, when the letters paused in their correct positions before shifting again, Patricia caught glimpses, flashes of clarity. A word here, a phrase there, not the whole page, not even the whole sentence, but pieces, fragments, like looking at a landscape through breaks in the clouds. She did not tell anyone at first. She was afraid that saying it out loud would make it stop, the way a dream dissolves when you try to describe it. But the changes continued. Each day the letters moved a little less. Each day the clarity lasted a little longer. It was not a dramatic, instantaneous healing. It was a process, a gradual, steady, measurable improvement that unfolded over weeks and months with the patience of a sunrise. Patricia began working with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a special education specialist at the University of Chicago, who had devoted her career to adult dyslexia. Dr. Torres was a scientist, a data-driven researcher who approached learning disabilities with rigorous methodology and peer-reviewed protocols. She was also a woman of quiet faith who prayed before every session, though she did not advertise this to her academic colleagues. When Patricia told her about the prayer meeting at Mount Zion and the changes that had followed, Dr. Torres listened without dismissal and without overstatement. "The brain is remarkably plastic," she told Patricia. "Neuroplasticity allows the brain to form new neural pathways at any age. What you're describing is consistent with what we see in adult dyslexia intervention, especially when combined with reduced stress and increased emotional support. The shame you carried for 20 years was itself a barrier to improvement. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, which impairs the very neural processes involved in reading. When you released that stress, through confession, through prayer, through community support, you created the conditions for your brain to begin healing itself." She paused. "Whether you attribute that to God or to neuroscience is frankly above my pay grade. What I can tell you is that something is working, and I want to help it work faster." They met 3 times a week. Dr. Torres introduced Patricia to tools and techniques that had not existed when Patricia was a child. Colored overlays that reduced the visual distortion caused by dyslexia. Specialized fonts designed to minimize letter reversal. Eye tracking exercises that strengthen the neural connections between visual processing and language comprehension. Patricia attacked each session with the same intensity she had once devoted to memorization, but this time the effort was directed not at hiding her weakness, but at confronting it. And the confrontation, terrifying as it was, produced results. By December, Patricia could read simple text with moderate fluency. Not perfectly, not the way a typical reader could, but functionally, meaningfully. She could pick up a children's book she had never seen, and with effort and concentration and the colored overlay that tinted the page a soft blue, decode the words on the page. Actually decode them, not from memory, from the page. The first time she read a full paragraph from an unfamiliar text without stopping, she was sitting in Dr. Torres's office. She read the paragraph aloud, slowly, carefully, each word a small victory, each sentence a conquered hill. When she reached the final period, she looked up. Dr. Torres was smiling. Patricia's eyes were filling with tears, and the paragraph she had read, randomly selected from a reading assessment, said this: "The best things in life are the things that come after we stop pretending." Patricia laughed through her tears. "God has a sense of humor," she said. "He does," Dr. Torres agreed. "He absolutely does." Back at school, the transformation was evident to everyone. Patricia still used many of her old strategies: the audio preparation, the memorization, the carefully designed lesson plans. But now they were supplements, not substitutes. She could read the textbook, slowly, with effort, but she could read it. And for the first time in her career, when a student asked her to explain a word on the page, she could look at the word and read it instead of reciting it from memory. The difference was invisible to the students, but to Patricia, it was the difference between performing and living. But the greatest change was not in her reading ability. It was in her freedom. Patricia no longer flinched when someone handed her a document. She no longer made excuses when asked to read aloud. She no longer lived in fear of the unexpected, the pop quiz of existence that had haunted her every waking moment. She told her students about her dyslexia, not as a confession of weakness, but as a declaration of identity. "I have dyslexia," she told her third graders one morning, standing in front of room 214 with the colored overlay in one hand and a book in the other. "It means my brain reads differently than most brains. It means letters move around on the page and words don't always cooperate. And it means I've had to work very, very hard to do something that comes easily to a lot of people. But here's what I want you to know. Different is not broken. Different is just different. And sometimes different is exactly what the world needs." The children listened with wide eyes. And Marcus Davis, sitting in the front row, the boy who had asked if the letters moved for her too, smiled. It was the first real smile anyone had seen from Marcus since he arrived at Banneker Elementary, and it contained more healing power than any therapy session or prayer meeting or neurological intervention on earth. Because when a child sees an adult who shares their struggle and has not been destroyed by it, something happens inside that child that cannot be achieved by any other means. Hope is born. Not the abstract theoretical hope that adults talk about in sermons and self-help books. The concrete, tangible, I can see it in front of me hope that says, if she made it, maybe I can make it too. The idea came to Patricia on a Saturday morning in February, 4 months after her breakdown in room 214. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she had cried over children's books for 20 years. And she was reading, a book about learning disabilities in children, given to her by Dr. Torres, full of research and strategies and case studies. She was reading it slowly, with her blue overlay, moving her finger along the lines the way she taught her first graders to do. And she was understanding it. And as she read about the millions of children in America who struggled with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, many of them undiagnosed, many of them labeled slow or lazy or not college material, many of them carrying the same shame she had carried, the idea arrived, not as a thought, but as a calling, as clear and unmistakable as any voice she had ever heard. She called Dr. Williams on Monday morning. "Linda, I want to start a program here at Banneker, a program for students with learning disabilities, not just dyslexia, all learning differences. I want to call it the Just Like Me program." She laid out the vision. A dedicated resource room, staffed by teachers trained in special education techniques, where students with learning disabilities could receive targeted support in a safe, shame-free environment, a curriculum that incorporated the latest assistive technologies, colored overlays, specialized fonts, audio support, speech-to-text tools, the same tools that had transformed Patricia's own reading. A mentorship component where older students who had navigated learning differences would guide younger ones through the process. And at the center of it all, the most important element, a culture of openness. A culture where struggling was not shameful, but shared. Where different was not broken, but valued. Where a child could raise their hand and say, "The letters are moving," and be met not with pity or confusion, but with understanding and practical help. "And I want to run it," Patricia said. "I want to be there, in that room, every day. Not as an administrator, as a teacher, as someone who has been where these kids are, as someone who can look them in the eye and say, 'I know exactly how you feel, because I feel it too, and we're going to get through this together.'" Dr. Williams approved the program within a week. The district provided funding. Dr. Torres volunteered to serve as a consultant. And in March, the Just Like Me program opened its doors in a converted storage room at the end of the second floor, hallway at Banneker Elementary, painted bright yellow by Patricia and a team of parent volunteers, decorated with posters that said things like, "Your brain is not broken, it's brilliant," and "Different readers, same dreams," furnished with beanbag chairs and noise-canceling headphones and tablets loaded with reading software, and a small bookshelf filled with books in dyslexia-friendly fonts. Marcus Davis was the first student enrolled. He walked into the yellow room on its first morning with his oversized backpack and his cautious eyes. And when he saw Patricia sitting in a beanbag chair with a blue overlay on her lap and a book in her hands, he set his backpack on the floor and said, "Just like you?" "Just like me," Patricia said. They worked together 3 times a week, one-on-one, Patricia teaching Marcus the strategies that Dr. Torres had taught her, the same strategies that were transforming her own reading, adapted and simplified for an 8-year-old mind. She taught him about the colored overlays. She taught him about tracking with his finger. She taught him about audiobooks and text-to-speech and the beautiful technology-enabled truth that there is more than one way to access a story. And she taught him the most important lesson of all, the lesson no textbook contained, that his brain was not his enemy, that the same neurological difference that made reading difficult also made his mind extraordinarily creative, intuitive, and resilient, that dyslexia was not a curse, but a different kind of wiring. And different wiring could produce different kinds of brilliance. Marcus began to change, slowly at first, and then with a momentum that surprised everyone, including Patricia. The boy who had been too afraid to speak on his first day at Banneker was now raising his hand in class. The boy who had pretended to be sick to avoid reading was now asking for extra reading time in the Just Like Me room. The boy whose notebook had been full of frustrated scribbles was now writing stories, short and misspelled and gloriously imaginative stories about superheroes who saved the world not with their fists, but with their brains. One afternoon in May, Marcus asked Patricia if he could read something to the class. She asked him what he wanted to read. He held up a piece of paper. On it, in large, slightly wobbly letters, some of them still reversed, but all of them legible, he had written a poem. "I wrote it myself," he said. "Can I read it?" Patricia set aside the lesson plan. She pulled a chair to the front of the room. She sat Marcus in the chair, facing his classmates, the same classmates who had watched him struggle and stumble and shrink for months. And Marcus Davis, 8 years old, dyslexic, formerly bullied, formerly silent, formerly convinced that he was stupid, held up his piece of paper and read his poem to room 214. "My brain is not like yours. My letters like to dance. They jump and spin and switch around. They do a funny dance. But that don't mean I'm dumb or slow. It means my brain's unique. And when I finally read a word, it means more than you think. Because I worked for every letter. I fought for every sound. And the words I read are treasure, because they're hard to found. The grammar was imperfect. The rhymes were approximate. The last line did not quite make sense. And it was, without question, the most beautiful thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Patricia was crying. The students were crying. Dr. Moore, the district supervisor who had inadvertently triggered the crisis months ago, and who had become an unexpected ally and supporter of the Just Like Me program, was standing in the doorway, crying. And Marcus, looking up from his poem with those large, dark eyes, said, "Miss Johnson taught me that. She taught me that my brain is not broken. She taught me because her brain is just like mine." The story left Banneker Elementary the way stories always leave, carried by the people it had touched, passed from mouth to ear to heart, growing and spreading with each telling. It started with the parents, the mothers and fathers of the children in the Just Like Me program, who had watched their sons and daughters go from defeated to determined, from ashamed to empowered, began talking. They talked at PTA meetings and at church functions and in grocery store checkout lines and on social media. They shared Patricia's story with her permission, and they shared their children's stories. And the stories landed in the hearts of other parents who recognized them. My daughter has been struggling for years. Nobody knew what was wrong. We thought she was lazy. My son was diagnosed with ADHD, but I always felt like there was something else. Something with the reading. I have a nephew who sounds exactly like Marcus. Where is this program? Can we enroll him? The calls started coming. Not just from within the Banneker School District, from across Chicago, from the suburbs, from downstate. Parents who had been searching for years for someone who understood, for a program that did not just treat their children's learning differences as deficits to be corrected, but as identities to be embraced. Then the media found the story. A reporter from the local CBS affiliate, a young woman named Angela Torres, was doing a segment on education in underserved communities. When a parent mentioned the Just Like Me program, Angela was intrigued. She visited Banneker. She interviewed Patricia. She interviewed Marcus. She interviewed Dr. Williams and Dr. Torres and the parents and the students. And when the segment aired on the 6 o'clock news, it struck a nerve so deep that the station's phone lines were overwhelmed within the hour. The segment showed Patricia in the yellow room, working with students, wearing her colored overlay like a badge of honor. It showed Marcus reading his poem. It showed the poster on the wall that said, "Your brain is not broken, it's brilliant." And it showed Patricia looking directly into the camera and saying, with the calm authority of a woman who has stopped hiding and discovered that the thing she was hiding was her greatest strength. I was a teacher who couldn't read. I hid it for 20 years because I thought it made me worthless. And then God showed me that the very thing I was most ashamed of was the very thing He wanted to use. My dyslexia isn't my weakness. It's my ministry. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in. Emails flooded the school's inbox. Parents drove from other states to visit the program. Other schools requested meetings to learn how to replicate it. The Chicago Board of Education sent a delegation. The Illinois State Board of Education sent a delegation. A nonprofit called the National Center for Learning Disabilities invited Patricia to speak at their annual conference. But the responses that mattered most to Patricia were not from institutions or media outlets. They were from individuals, from the adults, the grown men and women who had been hiding their own literacy struggles for decades, who had built their own masks and their own cathedrals of lies and their own midnight coping systems, and who had never told a soul. They found Patricia the way lost travelers find a lighthouse, following the light because the alternative is darkness. A 52-year-old construction foreman from the West Side who had not read a book since the 3rd grade. He had built a successful business by hiring people to handle all the paperwork. He drove to Banneker on a Saturday and stood in the parking lot for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to go inside. When he found Patricia, he said, "My whole life I thought I was the only one." The 38-year-old mother of 4 who had been homeschooling her children using exclusively audio materials because she could not read the textbooks. She had told her husband it was a teaching philosophy. She had never told him the truth. She sat in Patricia's classroom and wept for an hour and said, "I thought God made a mistake when he made me." A 26-year-old college graduate who had earned her degree through the same strategies Patricia had used: auditory learning, memorization, strategic avoidance of written assignments, and who was now working in marketing, terrified every day that someone would discover that her emails were composed entirely through voice to text. She wrote to Patricia, and the irony of using voice to text to compose the letter was not lost on either of them. "You are the first person who has ever made me feel like I don't have to apologize for my brain." Patricia answered every letter. She returned every phone call. She met with every person who showed up at Banneker looking for hope, and she told each of them the same thing she told her students. "You are not broken. You are not stupid. You are not alone. And the thing you are most ashamed of is the thing God wants to use for his glory." Marcus, meanwhile, was flourishing. By the end of the school year, his reading level had improved by 2 full grade levels. He was still dyslexic. He would always be dyslexic. The letters still danced, but the dance had slowed, and Marcus had learned the steps. And what had once been a battle was becoming a partnership between his extraordinary brain and the tools that Patricia and Dr. Torres had given him. He was writing stories regularly now, longer stories, more complex stories, stories about characters who were different and who discovered that their differences were not obstacles, but superpowers. He had also become something unexpected: a mentor. The younger students in the Just Like Me program looked up to him the way he had once looked up to Patricia. He would sit with a first grader who was crying over a reading assignment and say, in his quiet, matter-of-fact way, "Hey, I know the letters are moving. Mine do that too. But watch this." And he would pull out his colored overlay and show the child how to use it. And the child's tears would slow, and the letters would settle, and the reading would begin. And Marcus would sit there, patient and steady and proud. The boy who had been called stupid becoming the boy who showed others how to be brave. Patricia watched this happen and felt a joy so deep it bypassed her eyes and went straight to her bones. Because this was the miracle. Not the improvement in her reading, though that was remarkable. Not the program, though it was growing and helping dozens of children. Not the media attention, though it was spreading the message far beyond what she could have imagined. The miracle was this: the thing she had been most ashamed of, the thing she had hidden for 20 years, the thing she had begged God to keep secret, had become the thing that was setting other people free. Her wound had become her ministry. Her weakness had become her strength. Her shame had become her testimony. And every person it reached, every child who stopped crying, every adult who stopped hiding, every parent who stopped despairing, was proof that God does not waste anything. Not our failures, not our secrets, not our brokenness. He redeems all of it, every single piece. The invitation came in November, 1 year and 1 month after the day. Patricia Johnson walked out of room 214 with mascara on her cheeks and 20 years of lies falling apart behind her. Reverend James Crawford stood at the pulpit of Mount Zion Baptist Church during the announcements and said, with the particular warmth he reserved for moments he considered sacred, "Next Sunday, we have a very special scripture reading. Our own sister Patricia Johnson has agreed to read the Word of God to us. I've been asking her for years, and she has finally said yes. Let us lift her up in prayer this week." The congregation murmured with excitement. Patricia, sitting in her usual pew, 4th row right, felt her heart accelerate, and her palms go damp, and the old familiar whisper of fear brush against her ear. What if the letters dance? What if you stumble? What if they see that you can't do it? But alongside the fear, running parallel to it like a second river flowing beside the first, was something stronger. Peace. The same peace she had felt in the prayer room. The same peace that had been growing steadily for 12 months, not erasing the fear but outweighing it. The way a sunrise does not erase the night, but simply proves that the night was never permanent. She spent the week preparing. Not the old way, with frantic memorization and midnight audio sessions and the desperate rehearsal of a performance designed to conceal the truth. She prepared the new way. She read the passage, actually read it, with her blue overlay on the page and her finger tracking the lines and her lips moving silently as she decoded each word, one by one, the way a person crossing a stream steps from stone to stone, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of each step and full gratitude for each solid place to land. The passage was Isaiah 4100. Reverend Crawford had chosen it, and Patricia believed that God had chosen it through him, because the words could not have been more perfectly selected if she had written them herself. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. She read it 20 times that week. 20 times, with increasing fluency, with deepening understanding, with a sense of wonder that grew rather than diminished with each repetition, because she had heard this verse 1,000 times. She had memorized it from audio years ago. She could recite it from memory in her sleep, but she had never read it. She had never looked at those ancient words on a page and decoded them with her own eyes and her own brain, and felt them travel the pathway from sight to comprehension to meaning. And the experience of reading God's Word for the first time after 43 years of hearing it and memorizing it and living by it without ever being able to access it through the printed page was a kind of communion so intimate that it brought her to tears every single time. Sunday morning arrived the way all important mornings arrive, too quickly and not quickly enough. Patricia dressed in a royal blue dress that she had bought for the occasion, not because she needed new clothes, but because blue was the color of her overlay, the color that had given her access to the world of words, and she wanted to wear it the way a soldier wears a medal. She pinned her braids up with a silver clip. She put on her mother's pearl earrings, and she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and said out loud, "The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid." Mount Zion Baptist Church was full. Word had spread, the way word always spread in this congregation, that something significant was going to happen during the service. Patricia's story had become well known in the church by now. The congregation had prayed for her. They had supported her. They had watched her transformation with the awe and gratitude of people who believe in miracles, and had been given the privilege of witnessing one unfold in real time. And now they were here. Every pew filled, every seat taken, people standing along the walls. Marcus and his mother in the 3rd row, Dr. Williams and several teachers from Banneker in the 5th, Dr. Torres in the back, sitting quietly, a scientist in a church, observing something that her instruments could not measure, but her heart could not deny. The worship music ended. The choir sat down. Reverend Crawford approached the pulpit and adjusted the microphone and looked out at his congregation with the expression of a shepherd who loves his flock and is about to give them a gift. "Church," he said, "this morning, God's Word will be read to us by someone very special. Many of you know her story. Many of you have prayed for her. Some of you have wept for her. And today you're going to see the faithfulness of God demonstrated in a way that none of us will ever forget. Church, please welcome Sister Patricia Johnson." The applause began before she stood up. It grew as she walked to the front. It became thunderous as she climbed the 3 steps to the pulpit and stood behind the microphone, her blue overlay in one hand and her mother's Bible in the other. She placed the Bible on the pulpit and opened it to Isaiah 41. She placed the blue overlay on the page. She adjusted the microphone, and she looked out at the faces. She saw Marcus sitting straight in his pew, eyes bright, nodding encouragement the way she had once nodded encouragement to him. She saw her colleague Denise crying already, her hand pressed against her mouth. She saw Reverend Crawford standing to the side with his hands clasped, his lips moving in silent prayer. She saw the faces of people who had watched her hide for years and who were now watching her stand in the light, fully visible, fully known, fully free. "This reading is from the book of Isaiah," Patricia said. Her voice was steady but soft, the voice of a woman who has learned that true strength does not need to be loud. Chapter 41, verse 10. She looked down at the page. The words were there, black on white, with the blue tint of the overlay softening the contrast. The letters moved. They still moved. They would always move, but they moved slowly now, gently, like leaves stirring in a breeze rather than tumbling in a storm. And in the spaces between their movements, the words held still long enough for her to find them. "Fear not," she said the words slowly, deliberately, each syllable a victory, each consonant a monument. "For I am with you." She felt the congregation lean forward. She felt the weight of their attention, not as pressure, but as support, as if 400 people were holding her up with nothing but their love and their faith and their collective, unwavering belief that what was happening at this pulpit was holy. "Be not dismayed, for I am your God." Her finger moved along the line. The overlay tinted the page. Her brain worked, hard, harder than any brain in that room was working, decoding each letter, each word, each phrase, through a neurological pathway that was still damaged, still different, still dyslexic, but was also, finally, open, accessible, functioning, not perfectly, but faithfully, the way God's grace functions. Not perfectly, but faithfully. "I will strengthen you." Her voice grew stronger with each phrase, not because she was performing, but because the words themselves were strengthening her as she spoke them. She was not just reading scripture, she was being read by it. The word was doing its work in her even as it passed through her lips, and the congregation could feel it, and the room was charged with something that every person present would later describe in the same way: the presence of God. "I will help you." Her eyes were blurring with tears now, but she could still see the words, still decode them, still pull them from the page and release them into the air, because the tears were not obscuring her vision. They were clarifying it. For the first time in her life, Patricia Johnson was reading the Bible through tears of joy instead of tears of shame. And the difference was the difference between prison and paradise. "I will uphold you with my righteous right hand," she finished. She lifted her eyes from the page, and the church erupted, not with applause, with something deeper, with the sound of 400 people rising simultaneously to their feet, some of them clapping, some of them shouting, "Amen," some of them raising their hands, some of them weeping openly, all of them participating in a moment that was not about a woman reading a verse from a book, but about a God who takes the broken things of this world and makes them beautiful. Patricia stood at the pulpit and let the tears fall and did not wipe them away. She let them come. She let them run down her face and land on the open Bible, on the verse she had just read, on the words that had been waiting for her for 43 years. And she whispered into the microphone, barely audible over the sound of the congregation's response, "He upheld me. All those years, when I couldn't read and I was afraid and I thought I was alone, He upheld me with His righteous right hand." After the service in the fellowship hall, over coffee and cake, and the warm chaos of a congregation that has just witnessed something extraordinary. A young man approached Patricia. He was in his early 20s, tall and thin, with anxious eyes and hands that kept fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. He stood in front of her for a moment without speaking, working up the courage, gathering the words the way she had once gathered words, one at a time, with effort, with determination, with the desperate hope that they would come out right. "Miss Johnson," he said, "my name is David. I'm 23. I have dyslexia. I graduated from high school, but I can barely read. I got a job at a warehouse because I don't have to read there. I've been hiding it my whole life. My boss doesn't know. My girlfriend doesn't know. My mom thinks I grew out of it." He stopped. He swallowed. His eyes were red. "I saw you on the news, the CBS story, and I've been coming to this church for 3 weeks, waiting for the courage to talk to you. And today, watching you read that verse, I decided." He took a breath that shuddered on the way in. "I'm done hiding. I don't want to be ashamed anymore. Can you help me?" Patricia set down her coffee. She looked at this young man, this David, this 23-year-old, carrying the same secret she had carried for 20 years longer, and she saw herself. Not the broken, hiding, performing self she had been, the self she was becoming, the self that God had been shaping through every struggle, every tear, every dancing letter, every midnight prayer, every moment of shame that he was now, one by one, redeeming into glory. She took David's hands in hers. "Yes," she said, "I can help you. And do you know why? Because I'm just like you." If you are hiding something today, if there is a secret that you carry like a stone in your chest, a weakness you believe makes you unworthy, a struggle you are convinced would destroy you if anyone knew, I want you to hear what Patricia Johnson learned in a 3rd grade classroom on the south side of Chicago. Your shame is not your identity. It is your ministry waiting to be born. The very thing you are hiding is the very thing God wants to use. Not someday, not when you are fixed. Now, as you are, broken and beautiful, and exactly the person someone else needs to see standing at the front of the room, saying the words they are too afraid to say themselves. I struggle too. And it's okay. And God is with us. Share this with a teacher. Share it with a parent. Share it with anyone who has ever felt ashamed of the way their brain works. And if this story touched you, if it made you want to stop hiding and start living in the light, comment "No more shame" below, because shame dies in the light. And you, my friend, were made to shine.